All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with bite.
What do you get when the Gender Studies Department of your university dabbles in business economics?
Everybody works for somebody.
For that, I'll pay you a fair day's
Don't
wage.
use that range, boss. Tone of voice with me.
HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. Remember when the pay gap argument was supposedly about equal pay for equal work? Feminist researchers examined the overall earnings of the American worker, compared men's earnings to women's earnings, and found that women earned an average of about 22% less than men. Ignoring the generalized nature of the comparison, media and politicians began promoting the idea that women are paid 78 cents, give or take a few, for every dollar a man is paid for the same work. This, of course, led to calls for evaluation and reform. More feminist researchers examined the overall earnings of the American worker, compared men's earnings to women's, and confirmed that there was indeed a gap. The CONSAD Research Corporation was contracted by the U.S. Department of Labor to do a more in-depth evaluation in order to better understand the gap and what was needed to be done about it. Meanwhile, feminists continue to use the narrative on it as part of their evidence supporting a belief in an institutionalized patriarchal system under which women are oppressed. They called for changes in law and policy, including a proposed law that would give the state significant control over compensation for employment in the private sector. The Equal Pay Act already outlawed gender and race-based pay discrimination. The proposed Paycheck Fairness Act would have dictated that different jobs which were deemed to be similar by whatever controlling authority the law would set up must involve the same compensation. This would open businesses up to lawsuits by employees over pay disparity between positions in different departments, so that the employer would have to provide evidence that there were differences in the positions that justify any differences in compensation. The main argument given in favor of this is that if two different jobs involve the same level of labor, time investment, and skill requirement, both employees should receive the same compensation. Proponents of the law fail to take into consideration the reason jobs exist, the value of the work to the employer. There are numerous factors that can contribute to that value, including profitability, importance to company operations, worker qualifications, and even public interest in the job itself. The push for government intervention raises the question of whether we want government officials trying to evaluate every characteristic of every job and every worker in an effort to administer wage controls. Does that not sound like a bureaucratic nightmare? The CONSAD report came out in 2009 and discredited the main argument in favor of the Paycheck Fairness Act. U.S. women are not actually paid less than men for the same work. According to CONSAD, although additional research in this area is clearly needed, this study leads to the unambiguous conclusion that the differences in the compensation of men and women are the result of a multitude of factors, and that the raw wage gap should not be used as a basis to justify corrective action. Indeed, there may be nothing to correct. The differences in raw wages may be almost entirely the result of the individual choices being made by both male and female workers. According to the report's conclusion, this includes differences in decisions made by women and men in balancing their work, professional, and family lives. These factors include their human capital development, their work experience, the occupations and industries in which they work, and interruptions to their careers. The Paycheck Fairness Bill stalled and eventually seemed to be abandoned, but feminists still carry a torch for it. After their same work argument was discredited, they came out with some new ones. One involves a citation of division of labor at home, a knee-jerk response that has been tossed around for a couple of years. Another is the assertion that it's not women's choices that lead to their lower earnings, but that society values women's choices less because they are women's choices. Let's look at these separately for a moment. In response to being informed that women do not, in fact, do the same work in the workplace, feminists are offering up, "Yeah, but women do most of the housework and caregiving." That may or may not be true, but what relevance does it have in a discussion about compensation for work done in the workplace or for the benefit of the employer? Are we really discussing whether merit pay that takes hours and days worked into consideration is discrimination against women? What value does the work you do at home to support your lifestyle choices provide to your employer? Is this supposed to balance out some kind of floating social merit on which your employer is expected to base your compensation? The lifestyle merit argument doesn't contribute anything to a discussion on workplace compensation and shouldn't be accepted as an argument that supports identifying sexism as a cause in the so-called pay gap. Your employer doesn't owe you compensation for having babies and cleaning your house. What about the assertion that women's choices are valued less because they're made by women? Well, what choices are we talking about? If this is separate from the lifestyle merit argument, then the discussion isn't about work at home, as that is already covered. Recent conversation with a staunch male feminist gave me some answers. This new tack comes from a study that crowdsourced its dataset from surveys done on a hiring site called Glassdoor.com. The report describes the site's collection method thus. Glassdoor collects data via a decentralized crowdsourcing platform using a process known as a give-to-get model. When employees encounter Glassdoor, they are given a limited preview of the site's full content. To gain complete access, users are encouraged to contribute to the Glassdoor community by submitting an anonymous salary, company review, interview review, benefits review, or company photo. In this way, users give content to the online community to get access to job information provided by others. Aside from this request that users contribute content, use of Glassdoor's online jobs marketplace is completely free to users. Right away, this leads to the issue of whether the data can be considered accurate, as a number of factors can contribute to dishonest or mistaken answers. This also means that the dataset is being evaluated based on self-assessment regarding factors that contribute to pay scale, such as one's qualifications. Another issue is the set itself. According to the report, an important limitation of Glassdoor data is to note that it is a sample from online employees, which is not necessarily representative of the overall labor market in the countries we examine. Thus, we can only make valid statistical inferences about online employees, not necessarily offline workers. Workers who don't search for jobs online would be underrepresented. The report points out that this is the case with low-income workers. They also restricted their sample to full-time workers, a move which would eliminate a lot of other low-income jobs, particularly those in the retail and food service industries, even if workers do search for those positions online. Based on reporting on this large but limited crowdsourced data set, two main things are being asserted by pay gap myth proponents. One is that sexist attitudes lead to pay differences between jobs primarily done by men and jobs primarily done by women. That, of course, ignores every factor that contributes to the employer-employee agreement on pay. The other is that where the gap isn't eliminated between men and women of close age, at the same experience level, working the same hours, doing the same job at the same company for the same number of years, the only factor left to consider must be sexist attitudes that devalue work women do simply because women are the ones doing it. That follows feminist tendency to slap the sexism label on everything that cannot be explained by the most obvious factors. Proponents of this study talk as if every possible factor except sexism had been considered. In reality, the study only controlled for obvious details, such as age, education, experience, industry and occupation, and company size. This reduced the alleged gap to 8% for base pay. When they controlled for gender differences in occupation within different companies and sorted job titles into roughly 2,000 occupational categories based on similarity, the gap was further reduced to 5.4%. It is being argued that this 5.4% is a result of women's work being undervalued. This conclusion is based on a failure to consider other potentially confounding factors such as employee negotiation of pay, quality, quantity, and timing within job performance, cooperation with coworkers, cooperation with the employer, and the benefit the employer derives from the employee's work. The report also does not say whether education refers to job-specific education or simply having a degree. There is significant difference between a job-related degree and an unrelated one. Also buried in the report is the admission that the remaining 5.4% could be due to unobserved worker characteristics and that sexism is only a possible cause, not a confirmed one. The report then goes on to argue that gender differences in choices which account for the vast majority of the gap are not voluntary because people are slaves to social and gender norms. These norms are referred to as occupation and industry sorting of men and women into different jobs and industries. The argument here is that the combination of employer and job candidate characteristics and choices that determine which position an employee will hold, with which company, under what conditions, and at what compensation level are all affected by sexism toward women, wherein the involved choices are less valued if women make them. Between their various arguments on this topic, one could conclude that proponents of the pay gap myth do not understand business and employment. For crying out loud, nobody's choices are valued. Nobody walks into a job having an inherent value just for being there. You have to bring something to the job, like skill, diligence, work ethic, experience. You're there to benefit the employer. Society doesn't decide the value of your job. The financial value of your work is a measure of what it's worth to your employer to have a person perform the functions of the job and what it takes to persuade you to do that job. Those functions are the primary reason the job exists. It wasn't created for the sake of your income or to reward you for your merits. It was created because your employer had a need. Employers do not exist to create jobs. Most of them exist to make money, usually based on the creation, movement, marketing, or sale of goods and services. A net profit of $1 a week from an employer's work is the same dollar regardless of the employee's immutable characteristics. It is only changed by other factors, like whether the employer had to gross more to get that net dollar from your work than from another employee's work, or whether your net is less consistent, or whether managing your work presents an employer with more scheduling or personnel challenges. Your sex doesn't factor directly into any of that. What's the bottom line here? Feminists presume all choices equally valuable from the outset, only to be sorted out by gender later on. They consider equal outcomes to be owed on that basis. The vague arguments that victim cultists use to promote their pay gap myth break down under practical application. If your resume lists a degree in interdisciplinary studies and your competitor's resume lists a degree in information technology, sexism is not the reason he gets hired as an IT specialist and you get shuffled off into human resources. If your hours of availability exclude the 1 day a week that stock delivery is done at your store and your coworker can always be there that day, sexism is not the reason he gets promoted to the assistant management position responsible for receiving that delivery and you don't. Not all choices are equal, and recognizing that is not sex discrimination. The fact is not that choices are being devalued on the basis of sexist attitudes when they're made by women, but that, as the CONSAD report told us and Glassdoor unwittingly confirmed, for a variety of reasons women are making less lucrative career choices. Once again, this is not evidence of unequal pay for equal work, but that the work itself is unequal and the pattern of compensation matches. It is not the responsibility of employers to make up for the financial end of that by compensating based on politics instead of productivity. Maybe if more feminists majored in business economics instead of gender studies, we wouldn't have to tell them that. Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 69. Feminists don't understand work. And now we know Hannah doesn't understand the unmute button. And I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, and hopefully soon, Nonsense Annihilator, Lauren B. I think we may have had some wires crossed on the timing of the show. So, I don't know, she may be on later. Karen may be on later too, just depending or it may be just the two of us for the rest of the evening. We'll see what happens. But we're here to engage in some constructive criticism of one of feminism's dumbest social constructs, the pay gap. But first, a message from the non-fictional side of the internet. YouTube's glitches are getting weirder. Subscribers not notified, streams dropped, feminists falling out of the sky. If you want to keep up with what we're doing, you need notifications from badgerfeed.com. Register, receive notifications, be happy. If you want to support what we do, even in the midst of all the financial blacklisting that is taking place today, feedthebadger.com is the site for that. With Patreon hemorrhaging users and the demonetization fairy stalking Google Ads users, Feed the Badger is the most stable way to support our work. Remember, Badger Feed for information, Feed the Badger to support our work, because it's in our DNA to be confusing, since we are women after all. Last thing, if you want the opportunity to nag everyone else into checking us out, don't forget to smash that like button and share on every social media site that you use. And with that out of the way, oh my god, guys, this is the woozle that just won't die. The more feminists try to prove that working women are victimized by a discrimination-based pay gap, the more evidence they create that it is, in fact, an unequal work-based earnings gap. So what do? Exactly what we talked about in reference to the feminist advocacy research scam. They redefine the terms to frame unproven ideological beliefs as fact, marginalize actual facts and men's experiences, and portray women as victims of their own choices. And when they can't argue that they're doing the same real work as men, what do they fall back on? Say it, Prim.
Emotional labor.
It's like it's all they've got.
Of course. Oh God. And it's just, there's so much to talk about with this topic, and somehow it just never seems to die. It's immortal. We just can't kill it no matter what.
No, and anytime we get we get the information out there that explains what is actually going on in the industries they talk about. What is actually going on with salary differences and wage differences and hours differences and everything else. Along comes a new, brand new, complaint. And like this latest one that really gets me. I will read from this from page 21 of the Glassdoor study. This one blew my mind. It says only 14% of the gender gap in base pay is explained by differences in education and experience between men and women. By contrast, occupation and industry sorting of men and women into different jobs and industries explains 54% of the gap. So I'm like, what the heck is that? Well, it goes on to explain this is an important finding for policy solutions attempting to address the gender pay gap. Most of today's differences in male-female pay are due to forces that push men and women into different jobs and industries, including different paths through the educational system, pressures that divert men and women, men and women into different college majors and career tracks. Because there hasn't been a push to get more women into STEM for almost my entire lifetime. Like that never happened. It didn't exist, right? That's their excuse, these pressures. And then it goes on social norms regarding childcare and family responsibilities.
Oh, God.
Which is differences in education and experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, where to even start, right? Like, I guess a good place to start is with the first thing you talked about, the being forced into different job tracks. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, so like the idea about being forced into different job tracks is ridiculous. Like I having grown up in this society that this thing is based off of, nobody forced me to do anything. There's a reason that I didn't go into a mathematics degree, and that's because I stopped enjoying math right after school when all of a sudden graphing calculators became the norm. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with math or with women who enjoy that kind of thing. And it shouldn't mean there's anything wrong with women like me who don't enjoy that kind of thing. But did I stop enjoying it because I'm a woman? Well, I mean, that might partially contribute to it. Did I take an interest in psychology instead because I'm a woman? Again, maybe partially, but it's certainly not the only reason. Especially considering there are still men in the field, even though they're they're trying to do something about that clearly with the APA's nonsense. But what would these people have me do? Would they have me drop my current career track just because it's more traditionally feminine and have me start trying to pick up advanced calculus instead? Does it matter that sounds like the dullest life course that I could possibly switch into? You never know with these guys. What exactly do they want to have happen? What is the outcome in them saying, okay, well, you were clearly forced into this career track because you're a woman, even though that's a well-known, lesser paying field. It's not terrible, but it's certainly not up there with astrophysics, right? I knew that going into it. I went into it with the informed knowledge that it wasn't going to be $1 million career, and that's fine. I chose it because I liked it. So what is the problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the things that I've encountered with arguments with feminists about this, and I just had an argument that was almost a week long with a male feminist trying desperately to convince me that I was a victim of my own choices. That poor me, I didn't go into some other area of work besides the one that I went into, which I've actually done a whole bunch of different jobs. But yeah, and this guy, that's his thing. Free will is problematic. Free choice is problematic. And it's problematic because it's just an illusion. So women aren't actually responsible for any of the decisions they make because society and stuff, because patriarchy.
Oh my God. That's such a stupid thing to say too, because it excuse me, it fails to take into account the multitude of different choices that people will make for different reasons. Even while I've been studying to do psychology, for a period there, I as I've mentioned before on this show, I had taken a job painting houses, painting apartments, painting the outside of buildings, which is overwhelmingly a male-dominated career. So, I mean, even though my career track is decidedly more feminine, should I have stayed in painting just because I'm bucking social trends? What the hell's going on here?
Yeah, I can go over. My work history is really odd. So I started working as a 15-year-old officially, right? I learned as part of my family's photo business before that, but I didn't actually have to work as part of my family's photo business. I got to do things occasionally with the family, and I got paid for one chore. I used to number pictures. So this is kind of a weird thing to sort of bring into this, but the task involved looking at negatives, and then on the back of a 3.5 by 5 print, which is referred to as a proof because it's when you get your pictures printed professionally somewhere else instead of printing them yourself, it's run through a machine. The film is developed, and then a set of 3.5 by 5 prints is made, so every negative gets printed. My job was to make sure that there was a number on the back of each print that matched the negative number on the roll. And since, when you photograph a wedding, you might have anywhere from, 6 to 12 rolls of film. I think we might have had a couple weddings that were more than that because they were really big weddings. So you have the numbers, but then you also have a letter. This is roll A, this is roll B, this is roll C. And then the one complexity that would be added is negatives, 35 millimeter negatives, are numbered oddly. So it might be negative number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all up to 36, because we always did 36 exposure rolls. Or it might be 1A, 2A, and so on. Because the numbers may fall in between the negatives, and it has to do with, it's not an exact science loading a roll of film into a camera. So it might be off track a little bit. And so you pick the number that's closest, right? And this is all stuff I learned as like an 11-year-old kid, was when I was old enough to start doing this. And it was always a volunteer thing. If I didn't do it, my mom would do it. But if my mom did it, I didn't get paid. And if I did it, I did get paid. So I learned at 11 years old that if I wanted the money, then I would prioritize that work. And being a little OCD, I was suited to it, right? So that was a neat lesson to teach an 11-year-old kid. My parents never had a second thought about, well, Hannah's a girl, she didn't need to learn this. When I got older and I started doing photography for a living at 15, my brother started numbering pictures. He was a little older than I was when he got that lesson, because it was my job first, and I was the older kid, so I got it first. He had other things he did. I mean, he mowed lawns and stuff, and he learned that lesson outside the home. And his work, he was able to learn it with labor, as opposed to sort of meticulousness work. Which is also a difference in gender, but I wasn't allowed to mow the lawn because I'm allergic to grass. Twice, by the way. Oh, no. But that was I was a professional photographer at 15 years old. And I remained a professional photographer until, I guess it's only been a couple of years ago that I stopped doing it, right? And now, these are things that nobody pushed me into this. From the moment I started dabbling in it, which my dad gave me my first camera when I was 2, I was fascinated with it. I was really, I took to it, like a duck takes to water. If I hadn't been interested in it, he wouldn't have forced me into it. And I know that because my brother didn't really get into it until he was an adult. And he learned it. Dad made him learn it, but he didn't make him stick with it. Right. He just wanted it to be a skill he had. Now, for my personal experience, what that tells me is you don't force women into what they're doing. Society doesn't force women into what they're doing. I went through a whole bunch of other jobs. I've worked in a grocery store. I've worked as a donut maker in a bakery. I've worked as a cashier in a bakery. I worked at years ago, I worked at a Radio Shack for a while. I didn't have training, though, so I didn't have answers. I didn't work there very long. But I mean, I've worked as I worked as a camera salesperson in a camera store, a small one. Actually, it wasn't like corporate owned. It was a mom and pop shop. And, cool. I worked at a gas station. I've done physical labor. I am currently, besides this work, I am a direct support professional for intellectually disabled adults. And I've also been a security guard. I've had this whole range of different jobs that I've done. Nobody's ever said you can't do that because you're a girl. You can't do that because you're female. You're not going to get paid as much for doing that because we don't think you're going to do it as well because you're female. I've always gotten paid for what I did. I've done factory work. And I worked at a place that made like the Snackwell's snacks and stuff like that, and they made potato chips and all that. So I've done, conveyor belt line work where you have to sort stuff out and get rid of the defective stuff and so on. This is all, it's all just choices. And, I've had times in my life where I have had 3 jobs at once. I've had times in my life where I've had 2 jobs at the same time. And I've had a few rare instances, after adulthood where I only had 1 job, but not very many. And this idea that you can't do that is bullshit.
Well, exactly. I think about my main job aspiration was pretty much always to do psychology. From very early on, I had people tell me that I was a good listener, that They appreciated talking to me, things like that. And I thought, this could definitely be something that I would be happy doing as a career. And it was something that really called to me because, given my own experiences growing up with abuse, I wanted to help other people who were struggling with their own problems, right? So it was something that called to me for a number of different reasons. There was nobody pressuring me to do that. Like, I think about the jobs that I've done. I haven't had quite the storied list of careers that you've had, but I mean,
yeah. Well, one of the things I point out to people is that I'm a habitual screw up, right? Well, it's not fiction. It's not just a joke. Like my photography career was long term, right? But a lot of jobs that I've had, I left because I moved, broken relationships, things like that. So I've had a lot of jobs, yeah.
Well, I mean,
it is a great thing to find your passion and pursue it. So yeah.
And then there's the other side of it too, right? Because another one of my, like, art and drawing and things of that nature, but I consciously made the decision not to pursue that career because, given all of the information that I had gotten from other people and like online and things like that, I knew that it wasn't really the most viable career option. So I figured, I will just leave that one as a hobby. I'll use it in other ways. I've kind of been using it on my YouTube channel, but otherwise, pretty much it's just a hobby. It's something that I do for fun. It's not something that I decided to make my career because I'm not amazing at it, but that was a choice that I made for myself. So it was nobody pressuring me in or out of this career, which I'm pretty sure that art is another one of those career fields that's heavily female dominated. I might be wrong about that, but it was just something that I made that choice.
Yeah, I've seen that, what you're talking about, and it's kind of dominated. Certain areas of art are dominated by women. I've noticed, though, that there are more. It depends on what area of art you're going into.
I imagine the fine arts and things like that I was actually interested in. God knows I am terrible at graphic design. So
yeah, I've noticed more successful male graphic designers than female, but that might just be because my experience with graphic designers has all been in my journalistic work. See, my first photography work that was professional, outside of it's still family related, I guess, was a little newspaper in my hometown. At its peak, it had around 7,000 circulation. It wasn't a big newspaper, but it's not a big area either. At that newspaper, I did a bunch of stuff there too. I did layout and design for a while there. I worked as a photographer consistently from 1987 until like 1999. That's been my life's blood, photography, and I didn't go to school for it. I just started doing it when I was 2 years old and learned from my dad and learned from studying the art myself, and started developing film when I was 13. This is all of this stuff that is described in this Glassdoor study is completely alien to me because of the way that my life has gone, and I don't really think I'm an exception to the rule. I think it depends on the individual, because I know other women that have similar experiences. I know women that have had lifelong careers that they chose, and they chose them based on their interest and aptitudes. And I had, math was an interest for me when I was in school, but it wasn't an interest where I was gonna, I never had any ideas of becoming, math professor or mathematician or going into any of the careers that would have used the type of math that you have to take the higher math courses and everything. But I took calculus in high school. And
yeah,
I was lucky.
I did too, actually.
I got to take it from a former air traffic controller, and he was a great teacher.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah. So,
oh gosh, I was awful at calculus. That was my lowest grade in high school. I think I got 72 on it. So.
Oh gosh. Now, see, the thing I actually had difficulty with was foreign languages.
Oh, really?
Which is funny because when it comes to grammar and vocabulary, I was great with that, right? So your aptitudes can be really confusing. Your interest in aptitudes can be a really confusing topic to delve into, but they're not dictated by society.
No.
So the feminist idea is that society would have told me I had to go into more feminine areas of work, and like I've done both masculine and feminine work, and not had any problem switching back and forth between the two. And I look at this, right? I look at this, and I see this assertion that how did they phrase that again? And they call this occupation and industry sorting of men and women into different jobs and industries. So they talk about this in a passive way. The idea that when you start school and you start picking the subjects that interest you, and you start excelling at some things and struggling with other things, and like your natural tendency is like, well, I excel at this, so I'm going to do it more because I really like it, because I'm good at it. I get that positive feedback from my successes in it. That there's a societal pressure forcing you to do that if it happens to be a feminine thing.
Which is ridiculous. Like I think about math, because that's like it's a good, easy subject that I can talk about, because there's a distinct point in my life where like a switch happened. It used to be my favorite subject, like in junior high school, for example, or at least one of my favorite subjects. There was a period of time where I was doing something more interesting in language arts or whatever. So my math teacher, who was a guy, by the way, overheard me say that language arts was my favorite class right now, and he acted all hurt by it. But I mean, it was cute because he really made that class one of my favorite classes for me. A male teacher. So like these guys are acting like, oh, this is a gender segregated thing. People are pushing you down these career paths. And it's like, no, the teachers who made these subjects the most interesting for me were all male teachers. And it was I don't know if it's coincidental or if it was just because of the subject material, but when I started to really lose interest in math class was when I had a consistent female teacher. So I don't know, that might just be coincidental, but
it's not the first time I've heard that. This is something that goes into gender differences in styles of teaching, and this is something that I've talked about with my dad, because my dad was a elementary school teacher, so he didn't just teach one subject, he taught everything. He taught a sixth grade classroom, so he taught like all the subjects in that classroom. He taught in his school for a while where they divided the subjects among the teachers, and he had a set of subjects rather than all subjects, and the kids would go back and forth between classes like 2 or 3 times a day. And then he taught in the junior high, because elementary goes up to the 8th grade, or at least it did. I don't know if that's changed or not. So he also taught teenagers. He taught math, and he taught English and literature. And one of the things that one of the stories that he tells, and I'm not as good at telling this story because it's not my story, it's his story. He had one of the worst meetings that he had to go to when he was still teaching before he retired. Was the notebook meeting. And the women of the English department had this knockdown, drag-out, all-out war for hours over the question of whether the students to store their writing that would be presented on Parents' Night for the parents to see what the students were doing in school, whether they would store that in a spiral notebook or whether they would use a notebook with, I think they're called brads, those little clippy things that they look like a screw that splits and into two. It has two tabs,
like
you know. Yeah, I think those are called brads.
Or whatever.
Yeah, and you can, put the paper in and take it out, and whether that notebook had to have pockets in it or not, and whether they all had to be the same color, like this was not curriculum, not problems in the classroom. This was the biggest issue and they literally argued about this for like 2 hours, and all the guys are sitting there going, "Oh God, what are we?" And yes, No Names Left 0102 says we call them duotangs. So I think people know what I'm talking about. And, Scooter says yes, brads. So different people call them different things, but as long as you guys know what I'm talking about. And so finally, one of the teachers or the principal turns to my dad and asks what he thinks about the idea, because he's part of the English department at this point. Mm-hmm. And he's like, my students have to have a notebook that they can take the paper out of and then put the paper back into it. That's my only requirement. I think that's the only thing that's important. That they just have to be able to take it out for grading and then put it back in for storage. And this was this was so complicated and crazy that they just about short-circuited all of the women in the room.
Well, like,
they just
how
about
much
lost
time
their shit.
did they waste on
2
talking
hours
about this?
Two. And then on the way out, this is the best part. So he's walking out, and the women have all gotten angry and huffy and left in a huff, and the nerve, how dare he simplify it like that. Mansplaining was not a term at the time, but if they'd have had it, they would have said it, right?
Oh my God.
And one of the teachers turns to him, and he's like, that was the most intelligent thing said in the meeting the whole time. And my dad goes, well, I kind of lied. And he pulls a 3.5-inch floppy out of his pocket, and he goes, this is my student's notebook. But if I told them that, they would have killed me.
Oh my God.
At the end of the quarter, he would print things out for them, and they would put it, in a display notebook that they had not been using the entire rest of the quarter. And yeah, it was simply, you have to be able to take paper out of it. He didn't care if they used a 3-ring binder, as long as, the paper could be removed and put back.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, plus, like, it's just silly that they were wasting that much time on this. Like, 2 hours is okay. Like, say that this guy, what are they getting paid? Like, is their job worth that much to complain about the proper storage of notes for 2 hours? Like, that doesn't really seem like a worthwhile, like, use of one's dollars, right? Like,
well,
if
and you think about it.
So.
Yeah, you think about the difference in teaching styles there. You had these women who were focused on this minutia, right? That was just absolutely irrelevant. Did the students learn anything from having their female teachers be ultra nitpicky over the physical details of their display of their work? Or did they maybe learn from my dad's foray into the end of the 20th century? He didn't even have brand new computers. This was after oh gosh, I can't remember what level of Mac was. Can't remember what level of Mac was the newest Mac, but he had Mac Classics in the classroom, and I think an SE or two. And that's what they were doing their work on. They were typing their papers up on in software that was on those. I think they might even have been using Ready Set Go, which was an old desktop publishing program. And he had them learning not only the things that they were learning as part of their curriculum in terms of the type of writing they were doing, but also how to use the computers and how to use that particular type of software, how to treat the printer, and so on. So he had a whole set of lessons they were learning in his classroom that they weren't even getting anything close to that. And women had the opportunity to get those computers in their classrooms, and they didn't want to learn how to use them. So they declined, basically, to even try that out. And yeah, so the whole thing was just, that was one difference. Another one, another good example. So you learn in English, and you learn to tell the difference between adverbs and adjectives, and they make you memorize this whole list of what adverbs modify. Right.
Okay.
You go through and an adverbs modify da 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 da, and then that's your definition of an adverb. Dad, one of the things he learned when he was growing up is, if you have two things and it's an actual dichotomy, if it's one, it can't be the other. If it's the other, it can't be the one. Then you learn one really well, and if it's not that one, it's the other one. So adjectives modify nouns. They don't modify anything else. They only modify nouns. Adverbs don't. So he would test people. Is it an adjective or an adverb? And they had to remember, adjectives modify nouns. They don't have to learn every other form of speech as part of a list. Adverbs don't modify nouns. Adverbs modify everything else. But he didn't just go through, like, you memorize that stuff by rote in English class when you have a female teacher. He taught the kids what a modifier was. What did that mean? In his lesson, he made it funny. And it was shock humor, right?
Humor is something that I noticed a lot with the male teachers that was very rare with the female teachers. Like, the one teacher that I can think of that I had that was funny was primarily that way because she was so forgetful and like it wasn't really a deliberate thing, right? But the guys, they frequently used humor as a teaching tool, so it was a very different and more interactive style of learning a lot of the time.
Yeah, you remember things because of humor. You remember to structure your sentences properly because of humor. My high school, my junior year English teacher, he had a method that he used. He would put sentences up on the board where the incorrect structure of the sentence made it funny. The band played a salute to the rear of the audience. Really, the rear of the audience must have been something special, but that kind of thing. Like, you don't word it that way. You say, to the rear of the audience, the band played a salute. Or behind the audience, from the rear of the audience, the band played a salute. But not, if you put it at the end, then the salute is to the rear of the audience. And, you had stuff like that. You remembered it for the test because it was funny in class. And the same thing with that English lesson. Dad would go through and teach what a modifier is, and the students would remember their terms because they understood them, but they would also remember what a modifier was because he would say, all right, everybody picture a dog in your head. You got it? There's a dog. Thinking about a dog. Dead dog. Now it's modified. Or can I borrow a piece of paper? And they'd give him a blank piece of paper and he'd rip it in half. Rip! I just modified it. And so then he would have them explain, what does modify mean? And when the students would explain it to him, they would learn modify, they would understand modify, and then when he talked about a modifier, they would understand what he was saying. Never got anything like that from women, teaching grammar. When I took English, I guess it was my 7th and 8th grade year, I got stuck with the same woman. Who they hired because she was supposed to be bubbly and fun, and I couldn't stand her. I spent 2 years torturing her. Like, I'm not kidding. I did things like, we had to do a practical report, okay? You show how to do something. So I brought in my pet rat, and I showed how to clean out the rat cage because I knew she was nervous of rats.
Yep.
So I asked her to hold the rat while I did the work.
Wow.
So yeah,
I
I
actually
was a
hadn't.
little.
I actually
Go ahead.
had an English teacher that I kind of did the same thing too, sticking notes to her back and trying to toss little bits of eraser into her hair when she walked by, and it was just like that. That's really the only teacher that I did that with, but there was just something. I don't know. She was just so annoying, and she had this most awful high pitched voice. And I was like 14 at the time, and kids can be cruel. So I feel a little bad about it in hindsight, but at the time it was hilarious, and it was the only way to make the class even remotely bearable.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't feel bad about it in hindsight, because this particular teacher was, she was kind of rotten to me for being ill regularly and having to miss class, and that was not something I couldn't do anything to prevent that. I did try. I would do things like Mom would, bring in a thermometer and stick it under my tongue, and when she was out of the room, I'd take it out. And then when I heard her coming, I'd put it back in, and she would know, because my body temperature, if it had actually been 75 degrees, there would have been a serious problem. But yeah, so I was annoyed with this teacher for treating me like crap for being a kid with a health problem that took me out of school regularly, and she did things like. You have spelling words, and you had to write them in sentences. You did all these things to study your spelling, right? Well, I was good at spelling, and I didn't actually. None of those things contributed to my ability to pass a spelling test. So they were all just busy work for me. They didn't have any real purpose other than the fact that all of the students had to do that work. And she would get all caught up in, you must do this homework. And if you don't do this homework, I'm going to dock your grades and everything. Well, I'd come back from being out for a week with pneumonia or something, and I'd have this instruction from her. And this is an English teacher, okay? Put all of your spelling words in a sentence of 10 words or more. So I did. One sentence, paragraph long. She got mad at me. I was like, you said. Well, she made me do it over again. So
for Pete's sakes.
I wrote my individual sentences of, I think, like 12 or 15 spelling words. And I made it, those sentences into a story, essentially. Describing in graphic detail the experience of vomiting up the mucus that collects in your stomach when you have sinus drainage.
Wow.
For a week.
Nice.
So, if you're gonna pick on me, be ready to instruct away every potential. She learned to give me instructions that were a page long. Put each of your spelling words into a single sentence. Each sentence must be 10 words or more. Do not write about vomit.
Oh my gosh.
So I gave my English teacher more lessons than she gave me. And it's not necessarily like these are all anecdotes and everything, but I've run into that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally.
Throughout every place I've worked, I've run into that difference. If I'd have had a male teacher, he'd have nipped that in the bud. That wouldn't have lasted 2 days. But a male teacher wouldn't have given me, for the most part, none of my male teachers gave me crap for missing due to being ill until my senior year in high school. And then I finally had one male teacher that gave me crap for missing due to being ill. And, there were other problems with him that I'm not going to get into in this show, other than to say that if things had gone just a little bit differently, he probably would have been in jail.
Wow.
So not with me, with his wife, that he the girl he married my senior year. So yeah, that's a character issue more than anything.
Yeah, that sounds like it. But kind of just going back to the whole men and women making different choices and things like that. Just to sort of bring it back to the topic of the pay gap.
Yeah.
Like that just kind of, for example, I'm on maternity leave right now. I have a choice. I can either go back in a few months, or I can take a full year and a half off maternity leave.
That's a long maternity leave. Holy crap.
Yeah. It's unpaid. I technically have to go on EI.
Right,
so
right.
I mean, but still, I have that time that I can take if I choose to. Now, if I choose to stay at home with the baby rather than going back, and I fall out of the loop on things at work, things change a lot there. That's just the way it goes. Resources change. It's constantly in flux. Do I deserve the same raises as even my other female coworkers who didn't go on that leave? No, of course not. That would be silly. But even putting all that aside for a moment, is it a problem if I make the choice to do this? And plus, am I not getting benefits in a different way? Like, getting to spend additional time with my daughter, or saving us the need to possibly have to spend extra money on childcare or a nanny to cook and clean for the household. Like, why is it only the dollar amount getting deposited into my bank account that matters?
Yeah, see, that's another
missing
thing.
A lot of the point.
Exactly. That's another thing that people don't take into consideration when they're talking about the pay gap myth. It's not, like I talk about differences in work style and everything. There are, and we've talked about differences in, you choose to get a women's studies degree versus an IT degree, like I mentioned in the thing. It's not sexism to put you in human resources and to put the IT guy in IT. That's normal, right? And it's not sexism that forces a girl to take a women's study degree. It's her choice. Nobody has to do that. Nobody has to go into women's. I didn't go into women's studies. When I did go to college, I went to college considering two things. At one point I was going to be a teacher. At another point, and I ended up doing that for a while, but not in the way that I thought I was going to. And then I was going to be a nurse. And I learned that there was politics in nursing, and I also learned that nursing would actually take me away from the areas of healthcare that I really wanted to work in. So that was all a choice, and so I changed what I was doing, but that wasn't something that society came along and said you have to make these choices. It wasn't that I felt pressured by society. It was that I didn't feel pressure from society to make choices outside of my personal interest. I didn't feel responsible during my younger days for preparing to be the sole support of a family should I marry somebody who wanted to be a stay-at-home parent. Whereas men, they do have that pressure. So when feminists complain about pressures and they start talking about pressures women face, they've got it entirely backward. Women have options that men don't. I had the option to choose to go into a lower paying area of healthcare and be taken seriously making that choice and not be considered a deadbeat for making that choice. I had the option to change jobs a lot and not have employers look at me and say, well, you just don't stick with a job very well. I had the option to be taken seriously as an adjunct professor because I had a lot of experience in my area. So none of this was pressures. And the same thing is true with women who choose to go into gender studies. They have the option to go into an area of academic study that does nothing but focus on their gender and their victim status as part of their sex. Men don't have that option. Yeah. And furthermore, women have the option to go on maternity leave and stay at home and do the home work, those who say, well, it's just undervalued because it's women doing that work. It's like, well, why don't men ever stay at home with the kids? Well, first of all, I'm sure many dads would love the ability to stay at home with
with their kids and spend some quality time with their children, right? It's not as though work is often a super glamorous or especially enjoyable place for a lot of people, but a lot of the time dads don't have that option. They don't get the same amount of leave as moms by their workplaces. But do you see people like this petitioning for equal paternity leave for new fathers?
Well,
of course not. You see them demanding to get paid more for less work.
Yeah, the thing is, they're arguing for equal paternity leave on paper. The thing is, men can't always take that leave. If you are the sole supporter of your family, or the main breadwinner of your family, and that leave is unpaid, whether you're male or female, like a woman might be able to afford to take an unpaid leave because her husband is supporting her and their child. But a man, he's not necessarily in that situation, particularly if the mother is taking maternity leave. You can't both take leave, at least not an unpaid leave, unless you have saved up a lot of money to cover your living expenses while you're not working. So, exactly. This idea that it's even going to be equal when the requirements or the available options are equal is just not the case. And I've seen where women, for the most part, you have women taking jobs based on what they want to do, unless you get into the lower income areas, and then it's like, well, now you have to help support the household. You take what work you can get, which is why I ended up at a gas station. But women in the upper echelons of society, women in the upper classes, the upper financial classes, the ones that, usually are writing feminist dogma and feminist theory and so on, they have choices that the men in their lives don't have. They have the choice to focus on their areas of interest, whereas a man might have to choose a better paying job over a job that he really likes. I've watched the men in my life do that all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And furthermore, say a man and a woman are together and they're both in, I guess, decently paying jobs where one of them can afford to go on leave. How many times is it going to be the father that is prioritized to take the paternity leave? How many women are going to be like, totally okay with that? I'm gonna stay in my career and be driven. Like, I'm sure there's going to be some women that are like that, and they'll be perfectly content to let their husband take the paternity leave and stay at home with the kids. But it's often not nearly as common, right?
Well, they don't even want to give up the time with the kids.
Exactly.
It's not just a choice between types of work. It's, hey, I don't want to miss anything. You go back to work, you miss things.
Yeah,
so
I mean, not many women are going to be like that one woman or Silicon Valley. I've ever seen that show, but there's this woman on there who's basically a robot.
Oh boy.
Yeah, well, there's a joke in there where it's like, she's at work, she's a high-powered CEO, and they're like, didn't you just induce yesterday? And she's like, yes. And then she just gives them this look like, and so? Yeah. And then she just walks away. It's like, not many women are actually like that outside of humorous media, right? So
yeah,
it's not very common.
It's not common. What is common, in the lower income areas, you'll see women who work right up until, their labor, not because they love their jobs and they desperately want to do that, but because they can't afford to take the time off. Especially, like in the United States, we have a Family and Medical Leave Act. And that allows for a certain number of weeks for maternity leave in your workplace, that your employer has to allow you to take FMLA time to have your maternity leave. They save all of that time for from the birth on, so that they can be there early in the child's life and nurse and things like that. Well, in order to do that, you work while you're 8 months pregnant. And I worked at the gas station that I worked at, where there was physical labor involved, where there was lifting and you're on your feet all day and all of the things you're not supposed to be doing at the end of a pregnancy. And I worked with gals who stayed on the job. One gal stayed on the job. She called in sick the night she went into labor.
Wow.
And so like that was just the way it worked. That's just the way that you live if you are in the lower income classes in the United States. For people who are asking, FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. And it's an interesting, like, it was pushed for by feminists, but it was also pushed for by other political factions. And what it is your employer is not allowed to fire you for having to take time off because you are sick or because you have to provide care for a family member who has health concerns. So if you, for instance, you develop cancer and you have to go through chemo and you have to take a year off work because it makes you sick, your employer can't fire you for getting cancer. They have to keep your job open for a period of time until you know whether you can come back or not. The same thing with maternity leave. It lists a number of weeks that they have to allow for maternity or paternity leave. They don't have to pay you while you're on leave. And that law has been a mixed bag. When I was injured at work, I was forced to apply for FMLA and was told I would be fired if I didn't. And so then when I went through and filled out the paperwork after applying for FMLA, then they accused me of claiming that my injury was work-related when it was actually not. And that worked. They actually got out of paying my medical for the work-related injury. So, jeez. And it was an injury that happened during my work hours in the workplace because of the conditions that I was working under. And it was, that was fun to deal with.
Yeah, sounds like it.
But that would have happened whether I was male or female. That's just the way corporations are. But yeah, and it's good when it's available. It's bad that employers can exploit it against the employee. And I don't think it really needs to be tweaked a lot or anything. There are people that are trying to make maternity leave and paternity leave paid, and it's not necessarily feasible for every employer. And this is another one. This is a feminist initiative, and it's they don't have any consideration for whether the employer will be forced to rob Peter to pay Paul in terms of payroll, or rob Peter to pay Mary in terms of payroll. They don't care if it's going to cause job cuts, hours cuts, and so on, for them to be able to budget for this. They just think, oh, it would be nice if this existed, so we're going to force it on everybody.
Well, yeah. I mean, if ifs and buts were candies and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas. Right?
Yeah.
If only we could have everybody be paid $1 million and be able to take off as much time as they want. That would be a fantastic world, wouldn't it? But it's not really feasible.
No, it's really not. And it's one of the things that really bothers me about this is why I say they don't understand work. They look at it from the standpoint of if this is a really dearly held want or can be called a need, it is owed to the individual. And that the idea of what providing it to that individual entails, and what what impact that's going to have on the provider. Those don't matter to them. So they don't care if when they rob Peter to pay Mary, it puts Peter in financial duress. They don't care if when they rob Peter to pay Mary, it also affects, 20 other people of both sexes at Peter and Mary's workplace, right? They don't care about any of that. They only care about the thing they have said Mary deserves. There's a lot of things in the world you can say somebody deserves. I didn't deserve to be crapped on at that gas station. But
Right.
it's not society's job to protect me from that all of my life. And there were valuable lessons I learned from that. And if I had to deal with that type of situation again, I would know how to defend myself and protect myself. So, it's not all bad. And I've been through that before, too. I worked in a nursing home that was so bad. And I've talked about this before. I went to the head nurse on my floor, and then I went to the head nurse of all the head nurses, because the nurse on my floor was basically like, we don't talk about these things. And they were engaging in illegal levels of neglect. And, and she's like, oh, well, we don't talk about these things because there's nothing we can do about it. So I go to the head nurse, and she's like, no, we don't talk about these things. There's nothing we can do about it. I go to the administration at the building that I'm in. No, we don't talk about these things, and the potential solutions you've offered, we don't use those types of solutions. Don't talk about it anymore. So I go to corporate.
Geez.
I get threatened with and written up, basically, on made up stuff. Don't talk about these things. So I finally exhausted all of the possibilities within the company, and I go to the state. I'm like, because this was really not okay. And of course the state came in and dealt with the problem, and my work environment was made so hostile that I left.
Wow.
But it was
good for you for standing up for what was right, though.
Yeah, and it made a big difference. The nursing home is still in operation, and it's actually a really nice home now. But it was really a hellhole at the time. And, this was one of those things I think part of the reason it was allowed to go on that long was because a lot of women have a tendency when they see something wrong and they're in that environment, they don't look for solutions outside of their immediate environment. So they go to the immediate authority, and the immediate authority says, don't talk about this. They don't do anything else. Unless it's directly affecting them. If it had been an EEOC complaint, they'd have been screaming from the rooftops. But because it was the care they were providing, they didn't. And I didn't worry about losing that job because it was a crappy, 50 cents above minimum wage job. And I got another job that paid that much or more within a few weeks. So that's, those jobs are easily replaceable.
Well, see, what you should have been doing was arguing about the merits of using notebooks versus duotangs, and that would have been a better use of your time, I guess.
Far more important, yes. But, well, the big argument at that place was whether you call the supplemental devices used for incontinence diapers or briefs.
Oh, dear.
Which... any word that you use for him is going to eventually end up being undignified.
Right.
So the real answer was to not discuss individuals' use of them in front of other people. But, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to catch up a little bit on our super chats. We don't have a boatload of them, but we have some, and some of them are old, so I really want to catch those. Okay. At the beginning of the show, when we were just starting, Crawl Dragon gave us $2 and said, I got an ad for one of Trump's petitions. Lol. Isn't that perfect? At the beginning of our show, we have an ad for one of Trump's petitions. And it's a show on work. And what was it? The highest employment, or at least the lowest unemployment statistics for a wide variety of demographics in many years, women included. More women working now than years and years before. So then we have French Honey Badger gave us $10 and said, one's salary always tends to equal your marginal productivity. In other words, the value you bring to your employer. But remember, your price to him includes taxes he's legally prevented from showing you. And that's true too. In fact, when you, in the United States, when you get your check and you see that your employer has paid FICA, which is your Social Security tax, what you see is, I think, less than half. I think you see 6 and he pays 7 or 8% on top of that, on top of what he takes out of your check. And then you also have your regular income tax, your Medicaid tax. So your net, what you take home with you, isn't what's coming out of your employer's pocket at all. Your employer is sending a lot of money to the government just so you can work. And then there's the insurance and all of that stuff too. And of course, they also have to pay for their liability insurance. Depending on what type of company it is, they either have to pay for their potential liability if you get hurt on a job, or they have to prove that they're good for the expense if the state decides that it was their fault you got hurt on the job. And that's all stuff that you don't see. And then, of course, if they have any training they have to give you, that's an expense. So, you know, all of these things sort of factor in. But yeah, your pay is also dependent on, like, this is another one. Feminists will get annoyed if you have two people who are doing the same job, working in the same position, right? You got, you know, Chris and Pat working the same position. They are both cashiers at the gas station down the street from my house. And Chris and Pat both work at that gas station for 10 years. And after 10 years of small raises, Pat is making maybe $1 more an hour than Chris. And they just assume that if Pat is male and Chris is female, that's because Pat is a man and Chris is a woman. And it doesn't have anything to do with anything else. But what if Chris only does just the bare minimum of, you must get these tasks done today? And Pat did that also, but on top of that, anytime anything needed to be brought into the store from the shed, Pat was the one that had to go out there because bad weather, or it's dark outside and there might be a scary man out there, or it's too heavy for Chris, you know. And Pat
went in to periodically ask for raises after set periods of time,
right,
also,
right.
Chris didn't do that.
You know, and then there's also the potential, you know, both of them were available to work 40 hours a week, but Chris wanted that 40 hours to all be, you know, I can only work these days, and I can only work first shift, and I can't take any overtime, and I want holidays off and all that. Yeah. Whereas Pat, you know, said, well, I can do swing shift, and I can work at night, even though people bring in guns occasionally and rob the store. And I don't have to work the same days every week. I just need to know, you know, my schedule ahead of time. And I can work some holidays. You know, I'm not going to complain when I get scheduled on a holiday. And I'm not going to ask for as much time off. You know, I'm not going to have to trade with other shifts with other employees as much. And when employees need to trade shifts, I'm available to do that. You know, if you get that going on, the boss is going to notice that, and the boss is going to say, well, you know, maybe this guy's worth a little more. And it happens whether Chris and Pat are opposite genders or the same. Chris and Pat could both be women, and the same effect would take place. You know, Chris and Pat could both be men.
And that's realistically how it should be, because people People should be getting paid not based on what's between their legs, but based on the kind of work that they do. And if Chris is going to decide to be a crap worker, then that's on Chris.
Yeah, or even if Chris is an okay worker, but Pat's a stellar worker. You know?
Exactly.
If you got customers coming in all the time saying, man, I was really glad Pat was here when I came in because Pat just made my day. Pat made me laugh today, I used to have customers that would come in, and I had a physics professor that would come in, and I would make dumb math jokes at him, and he would laugh. And I think what was the dumbest one I did? The physics professor that was that came to work intoxicated. What happened with the physics professor that came to work intoxicated, or the math professor that came to work intoxicated? And he looks at me and he's like, "What happened?" And I said, "He got arrested for drunk driving."
God damn it.
And like that guy he laughed every day that he came in because I always had something like that for him. You do stuff like that, and your employer gets, I really like this employee, from the customers. It affects your pay. And the same thing happens, like, a lot of women don't understand that. A lot of women just don't get it. Waitresses do. Some retail workers do, but a lot of women don't. So salary, your productivity is important. The value you bring to your employer, when I mention productivity, it's just sort of a thing, but the value you bring to your employer can be very, very detailed and well-rounded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it should be obvious, but this narrative keeps getting put out there, and it's a lot easier to just chalk it up to some nebulous, it's just because I'm a woman, rather than look inward at yourself and be like, well, maybe I could be trying harder in this or this area, or maybe I could, muster up the courage to go and ask for a raise or something like that, No, it's easier to just say, no, it's because I'm a woman and discrimination, and I'm just going to complain about it and nothing's going to change.
Tiamat Michelle Hart says, my mathematician friend signed a contract and asked me to co-sign.
Oh,
no. See, I would have had fun with that. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to get on a tangent. There we go, Tiamat. But yeah, this is like, there's so much that contributes to the workplace, and proponents of the Glassdoor study talk about this as though everything's been taken into consideration in this study, and somehow the idea that they haven't been able to eliminate pay differences indicates that there must be sexism. But just from the little things like that are discussed, I tell the story all the time about the time my female coworkers at the gas station were going to leave puke in the men's room for an entire weekend because they wanted the male manager to take care of it, rather than, the assistant manager to take care of it, rather than taking care of it right away. And if I hadn't gone in there and cleaned that up, he would have come in Monday morning to dried puke all over the place in the restroom. And the fact that men have to deal with that behavior from women in the workplace on a regular basis, that never gets taken into consideration in these feminist studies. The fact that women might have their schedules more tightly controlled by the employee, where they say, well, I can't work on Thursdays, or I can only work first shift, or I can only work second shift, stuff like that. Those are all things that employers take into consideration that you can't actually quantify in a study, because they happen individually in individual workplaces, and it's not a matter of society valuing women's choices less. It is a matter of women having choices that men don't, and women's choices being less productive and less not just valuable, but contributory, I guess would be the word, to their employer. That they're not bringing something to their employer when they do that. They're taking something from their employer for themselves. And to expect the employer to pay you for that is very solipsistic and selfish. But going on with the super chats, the next one is Master Rogue, gave us $2 and says, Prim! Huggy face, heart, smiley face, and then he says, having a bad week, teary face.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. That's no good.
Me too. Cyber hugs. But Mr. Roboto gave us $2 and said they understand work, they don't want to do it. And there is that. Like I said, my 2 female coworkers, we're not going to clean up the puke in the restroom even though it's part of our job. We're going to leave it. And the excuse is it's the men's room.
Oh, for Pete's sake.
Seriously.
I had to clean up an ass-splosion in the men's room.
Oh, God.
Working at A&W, it's like, okay, did you just like lean over the toilet and spread them and just blast ass? Like, I'm not even kidding. It was a puddle around the toilet, on the walls, everywhere. It was the worst thing I have ever seen. Oh. And I was the one that got shafted into cleaning it.
Yeah, that's
just
one
terrible.
I've had to deal with that before too. Both sexes'
Half a
restrooms.
Bucket of bleach.
Yeah, and you really want to do the germ care thing in that because that's probably food poisoning that caused it. And yeah, so it's bad.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Oh, hazmat suit.
Yep. I got made fun of for that, and I'm like, I am handling the food. And I'm like, I put on the full hazmat suit to go in and clean up that puke. I'm the food handler in the store, and I'm the one going into the bathroom and cleaning up puke and diarrhea. Yes, I'm going to wear the personal protective equipment. I'm going to take off.
Would you rather I not?
outer garments from my uniform before I go in there too. And then when I get done, I will put them back on after I have scrubbed, every surface of my exposed skin to make sure that I'm not going to be transferring. Like, I'm not going to become typhoid Hannah. Come on.
Well, exactly.
Brilliance.
For Pete's sakes.
Right. So yeah, that was another one. It was the gals. These were just ordinary gals. They never worked in healthcare. They didn't have the education from their family that I had from my family, because I come from a line of nurses and midwives, and among other jobs. I mean, I got people in my family that have been teachers, people that have been truckers, a lot of different things. But because there are several medical professionals in my family, I know things that normally you don't know unless you go to school for that. And so I knew all about the history of Typhoid Mary. That was like, hand washing was taught well enough at my house when I was growing up that I was the only one who didn't have glowy stuff left on my hands when they tested us for it in nurses aid training. They have this stuff they put on your hands that glows under a black light, and they have you wash your hands. And I washed all of it off. The only place it stuck was in the cracks around the, where your knuckles wrinkle, when you straighten your fingers. And I had one spot. And that was it.
Oh, wow.
Like everybody else had, when you wash, most of the time when you wash your hands, you miss the area on the outside of your pinky finger, that part of your hand, and you miss the little crotch between your thumb and forefinger. A lot of people leave dirt in the lines in the palm of their hand that the palm reader would read, and believe it or not, the backs of your hands. A lot of people leave dirt on the backs of their hands. I had all of that clean. Luminol, yes, that's what it was, neat scholar. It's like, it's just, natural for me to do that stuff anyway, but it's, even without that knowledge, they were all terrified of going in there and cleaning, and they sent the food worker in there to do that. So, it was fortunate for my customers that I had that knowledge. Crawl Dragon gave us $10 and said, I had a female teacher in the 4th grade who threatened to put me in detention because I had a Pikachu backpack. What's wrong with Pikachu?
What? That was like the most popular thing ever when I was in. Sakes.
I don't understand that one. My mom told me to call her bluff. I didn't get detention, and Pikachu was safe. Smiley face, with the little cat lips. And Syria de Flora gave us $5 and said, I had a teacher in grade school who refused to follow my IEP paperwork. Oh, that's like really an infraction. Paperwork until my mom threatened to sue the school. Yeah, that would have been, that's like, geez.
I don't know what IEP is in this case.
Individual education plan. And it's like if you have a learning disability, if you have a physical handicap, if you have anything that basically would interfere with your education, that you can't do anything about it, and the school can accommodate you. They give you an individual education plan, or at least they're supposed to. And a student, like any student that has something like autism, or if you have a particular, like there were students in my school that had IEPs because of physical handicaps that affected their mobility. There were students in my school that had IEPs because their families had gone through catastrophic, like, divorce situations, and they were in therapy. So there are different things. There was at least one student that I know that had an IEP specifically just due to severe test anxiety that may have been caused by an elementary school teacher's behavior. And that IEP continued throughout high school because the test anxiety continued throughout high school. So, yeah and they absolutely have to, dyslexia can, Rat King said dyslexia all the way, and that can lead to an IEP, especially if it's severe, because it can lead to your ability to take tests at the same speed that other students do being completely destroyed.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
So
yeah, I could see somebody refusing to do that. That would be completely messed up.
Yeah, it would be tantamount to denying the student equal opportunity at an education.
Yikes.
But I'm not surprised that it happens. There are teachers that just get it into their heads that this stuff is unnecessary and they shouldn't have to follow it. Like, this is another one. And this is not a gender thing. Because I saw it with both sexes. There were the two professors that really gave me crap over it. One was male and the other was female. So it's an elitist thing. I had a student in my IT photography class. It was IT 101 121, beginning photography, and it was actually a business course. It was I was teaching students to use photography in employment situations where they might be doing the company newsletter, or they might be the person that takes the company photo that's going to be put up on the wall outside of the offices, or photograph product for sale, things like that. So they basically had to learn layout and design, a little bit of layout and design. They had to learn the basics of photography. They had to learn some portraiture, just in still life. Basic things. And none of it was really complicated. None of it was stuff that if they missed one class, it was going to just be the end of the world. Right? I wasn't teaching surgical procedures. I was teaching them how to use a camera in conjunction with their actual job, not as their full-time job. And I had a student who was a soldier who was he signed up for the class, and then he got stationed overseas, and he got his assignment. He was going to be back for all but the first 2 weeks and the last week of the class. So I videotaped my lessons for the first 2 weeks, and I gave him ahead of time information regarding the final project. And his girlfriend helped to make sure he got all the information he needed, and all of his work got turned in and everything. And that allowed him to participate in the class. So I basically gave him an IEP. And I did that because, it was, the student wasn't refusing to do the classwork. The student was presented with a hurdle. You must, deal with this situation, and it's going to affect your ability to attend class normally. And it wasn't like this was, something that the student decided, I want to go to origins, or I want to take a vacation or something like that. No, it was his job, and his job was serving our country, and it wasn't it's something where he could say to his employer, I really want to take this class. Can I delay this or change it? He didn't have a choice. Man, I had 2 professors just jump down my throat because they felt pressured to accommodate this student because I had accommodated him. Like, that's the point. You're there. Your goal, your reason for being is for the student to learn the material that you are presenting in your class and to be able to demonstrate having learned that material at the end of the class. That is it. You're not there to be prestigious. You're not there to be difficult. You're not there to make the students jump through a bunch of hoops.
Right, yeah, exactly.
So there's that in academia as well. And I kind of suspect when teachers go off on a tirade or a tangent, and they refuse to accommodate a student that has something like dyslexia or autism or a physical handicap or something like that, they're really being elitist assholes.
Right. Jesus. And I mean, like, why would you want to be an asshole in that case? Like, for Pete's sake, we're talking about a child in need here. Like, what are you trying to prove?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's what the hell are you doing in that job?
Exactly.
And in
like,
elementary,
if you want to be a power tripping asshole, then go start up your own company, be a CEO, boss your employees around, and be a crap business. But
Power Trip Incorporated.
Well, and like, don't take it out on kids, like people who
Really?
can't defend themselves. Like, that's terrible.
It's really it really pisses me off when I see stuff like that. But it I wish I could say it surprised me too, but it doesn't. But I will go on with the next one. Joe Heel gave us that's pounds.
Pounds, yeah.
Okay, 10 pounds. Said, at work, I once worked with a woman who complained to my manager that I was paid more than her. My manager's response, he is paid more than you because he is your supervisor. And she still didn't get it. So that's another one. Feminists have pushed, that's not the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which did pass. This is the Workplace Fairness Act. We'll get into a little bit about the Workplace Fairness Act. This really bothers me. So when I worked at that nursing home, there were a variety of positions. You had the nurse's aides were the bulk of employees. And as a nurse's aide, you get like 3 weeks training, you get a certification. Your job is to help people with their daily activities, and it could include things like getting dressed, getting their breakfast, making sure they get to and from activities around the nursing home, helping them get into and out of their chairs and their beds, the bathroom if needed. Some people are more physically independent than others. Some people are more mentally independent than others. So you have a set of patients under your care that you are going to have, tasks to do. And I always joked about being a professional butt wiper because there are individuals who are completely incapacitated or largely incapacitated to the degree of being incontinent and unaware of it. So you range from people that you simply go in and be there while they're going about their daily activities to make sure they don't fall down or things like that, to people that you do even the most basic things they can't do for themselves. And that's like the bulk. And that's actually one of the lowest paid jobs in the nursing home. Because you don't have to have a lot of education to be able to do it. They can hire almost anyone to do it. Their potential workforce is huge. And you're kind of disposable in that position because of that. Then they also have housekeeping, and that's basic housekeeping. They do laundry. They do janitorial stuff. You have the cooking staff, and there's the supervisors who do have to have some expertise, and then there are the task workers in the kitchen who don't. And you also have the nurses every floor has at least one nurse to, I think nurses are allowed to have 28 patients under their care.
Okay.
So, then you have the head nurse who's in charge of all of the nurses, and you have administrative staff and a receptionist. So all of these positions have different tasks they do, different levels of expertise, and so on. According to the Paycheck Fairness Act, if the entity in charge, right, the government agency that would be put in charge of deciding who is worth what, if they look at these jobs and they decide the amount of physical labor that the nurse's aide does, and the amount of expertise that the nurse's aide has, and so on, is equal to or greater than that of a supervisor in the housekeeping department, that it would be unfair to pay the nurse's aide less than the supervisor, even though in a supervisory position your level of responsibility is high enough that not everybody can do that job. And the same thing, they might look at nurses and people in administration and say, well, why is this administrator who has less education than a nurse getting paid more than the nurse? Well, because maybe the administrator is responsible for a significant amount more of the nursing home's financial stability. And maybe there's the particular set of skills, no reference intended, but the particular set of skills that the administrator has is more rare than the set of educational achievement that you have to become a nurse, right? So they got all this stuff being taken into consideration by the employer that they just want to scrap and say, nope, the government gets to decide that. And it is a bureaucratic nightmare. They may end up telling employers that they cannot reward people for making sure that the company remains financially stable because you don't have the degree that a nurse has. It's just nuts.
Well, and it's just ridiculous how many different factors there are to take into account that these guys just don't take into account. It's like, no, let's just reduce all of it down to men versus women. And it just misses so many different things. Like it misses the amount of time that somebody has been there for. It misses the special skills that you mentioned. Somebody could have gotten like 5 different small certifications that lined them up perfectly into this position that fits in a way that they haven't been able to find in anybody else. So
Right.
They really want to keep this person on staff, even though it maybe wasn't a 4-year degree, but more people have that 4-year degree, making those people more common, whereas this person is perfect for this one job.
Right, or the administrative staff in question might be one of the original founders of the company.
Yeah, that too. Or like anything else. Like there are so many things to keep into account. Maybe that person has never taken a vacation day in their entire time that they've been there, and that's really impressive, and they want to compensate for that, Like,
Right.
I don't know. There are a number of different reasons. To try and simplify it down to just men versus women, it just misses all of it. But these guys do it every damn time.
Yeah,
Like,
and this
get
is
a new mantra already.
and it's basically the basic push is to give the government more control over the individual's life. It's more control over your relationship with your employer. And it's not giving the employee necessarily a tool. What ends up happening, if your employer is in a situation where they're being told they got to pay the nurses the same as the administrative staff, they're not going to raise the nurses' salaries to match the administrative staff. They're going to lower the administrative staff to meet the nurses and to match the nurses, because they can't afford to pay 8 nurses the same as 1 administrative staff. So that's just it's one of the dumbest things they've come up with in terms of benefit to the employee and the workplace. but it does benefit feminism, just in that they have more to complain about and more claims to make and so on. But yeah, that's that idea of not understanding that a supervisor gets paid more than a regular employee because of the supervisor's additional responsibilities and the additional training and so on. That's typical. And we just got a $10 super chat from Meredith Glassberg, who says, I have dyslexia, and I will tell you that any parent of a kid with a disability will spend their kid's entire career having to advocate and fight the schools. It's SOP. I don't know SOP. That's not one that I'm familiar with. But actually, I do know.
Yeah, me neither.
I do know that that's the case if your kid doesn't fit the mold. My parents had to do that too, and there were two ways they had to do it. One of them was because of the degree to which my asthma messed with my ability to attend school and participate in school-related activities. I had a gym teacher who did not understand that a student who had asthma, severe asthma, standard operating procedure, okay, but that a student who had severe asthma, after contracting pneumonia and getting past the point of being contagious, might be able to come back to school and sit in the classroom, but couldn't necessarily spend an hour running and not have problems, right? So my doctor had given me an order. I was not to participate in gym class, which that bothered the hell out of me because I liked gym class. My teacher was going to dock me for it. And my parents had to go in and fight that battle. And she didn't know, because she was new to the school, she didn't know that I was a cross-country runner and a actually star hurdler for our school. She just saw a kid getting out of gym class for a week.
For Pete's sake.
Like, this is the same teacher that ordered me to keep my emergency inhaler downstairs in the locker room, away from the gym class. And tried to penalize me for having it on me.
These people are insane.
Yeah, and I had a doctor's order to carry it on my person at all times. Because
like you do with emergency things that you need to save your life, potentially.
School administrators have been really dumb about this. It is in Ohio. You have to have, now it's normal to have a doctor's note if you have to have medication at school. But you have to have a doctor's note that specifies your need for your emergency medication. And then you have to have a separate doctor's note that specifies you can use it yourself. And the reason for that is they don't want 5-year-olds dosing themselves with an inhaler or an EpiPen. But they go so far with it that if you're 17 years old and you're going to turn 18 halfway through your senior year in high school, and you have an inhaler or an EpiPen that you're supposed to have, and you have the note that says that you have to use this, and the note, or you have to have this available, and the note that says that you are allowed to dose it yourself. And the school has a part-time nurse, so the nurse's office is locked half the time. You got to get yet another separate note that says you have to be allowed to carry it with you. And then the school can say no. And there have been mostly boys who have died from asthma attacks at school because they have been denied access to their emergency medicine. And that's happened under zero tolerance policies. That's happened for like the last 30 years. That students, particularly students with asthma, nobody wants to recognize the threat level that asthma presents because it's not a consistent, constant threat. It's something that happens suddenly and under circumstances that are not necessarily predictable. And,
right.
So that's like bureaucracy. And of course, feminists are arguing, let's add that kind of bureaucratic stupidity to the workplace. We'll increase them, right?
Can we not, though?
Yeah.
Please. Jeez.
Exactly. And so I look, yeah, like seizures. Seizures are another one, Rat King. There's a medication that is an emergency medication in the case of seizures. Now that was one that has to be administered by somebody else, because when you're in the midst of a seizure, you're helpless completely. And that's another one that you got to get that. You can't just take that. You can't just have that at school. You have to actually have a doctor's note that says that you need it. And if the nurse's office is locked at some point, and nobody can get in and get the medication, there is nothing they can do to help when you have that seizure, other than clear the area so that you don't get bumped into anything, and monitor you. Tyler Preston says, what kind of terrible school did you go to? Well, actually, to be honest, that's the norm. I went to a perfectly ordinary, average school. Now, my principal stood up for me in that instance. My parents had to go in and fight. My principal looked at the gym teacher and gave her a history of my efforts to fight my illness and everything, right? Gave her a history of my athletic participation and said, you don't know what you're doing, leave her alone. But that's the way that schools in general react. And that's what I was describing. That's Ohio policy. That's bureaucratic policy. This is the problem with bureaucratic policy. If they start deciding that the government can come in and order your employer to alter the way they're paying employees and alter how much they're paying, what position and all that, it's going to be that level of bureaucracy that is going to make that determination. And that Ohio policy I was talking about, every state has their own policy. And if a law like the Paycheck Fairness Act goes through, every state's going to have their own policy. Every state has their own policy on medical issues in the school, and a lot of them have that similar zero tolerance pattern. And the same thing's going to happen with Paycheck Fairness. Every state's going to have their and then every local bureaucrat is going to interpret that policy differently. And you're always going to have some asshole that's going to come along and decide that just because a worker in a particular position doesn't have anything unique to offer to the employer that the employer specifically has to incentivize, doesn't mean that person shouldn't be paid the same as somebody who does. If they're doing tasks every day that involve the same amount of labor, even if one of them has rare training as opposed to common training, if it's the same level of training, they must be paid the same.
Yep.
And it's going to be one of those situations where the employer would have to be able to go in and argue in court in detail, why they would be justified in doing differently. The next thing that happens is merit pay goes by the wayside. Incentive pay goes by the wayside. Yeah, so your job's a little dirtier than another job. Doesn't mean you deserve more pay for having to do that, and that's what basically feminism is promoting here, and that's what where the wage gap is actually a dangerous myth and not just a stupid one.
Right.
So, but I think we've sort of talked our way all the way around this and through it.
I think so.
Yeah, we've done our job for the night.
Yeah, exactly. Considering it was just the two of us.
Yeah.
I mean, these hours could have been better spent talking about do-a-tangs, but hey, whatever, man.
Yeah, we should have had a whole debate over what's the better way to record the sound for the show, whether we should be using Audacity or some other software.
Exactly. There we go.
And of course, this show we didn't have to do that anyway. So, and anyway.
Yep.
But yeah, it's just a situation that we have to keep our finger on, keep our eye on, and don't back down when you get a feminist that starts arguing that women are victims of their own choices. And when they present you with research, look for weasel wording, because that one bit there, sorting of men and women into different jobs, makes it sound like they're talking about men and women having
something.
Men and women having no role in the decision-making process regarding what job they will take. Sorting of men and women into different jobs. Differences in male-female pay being due to forces that push men and women into different jobs. Including different paths through education and all that. That is so weaselly. Like, it takes no agency, no personal agency into consideration at all. No ideas about aptitude and attitudes, no ideas about personal interest, preferences and stuff like that might form simply because of, the reward system of, hey, I have had a success, achievement, ding, none of that. So that's, definitely when you're presented with that kind of thing, look for that, because it's peppered throughout that research. And this is a not stellar example, but a screaming example of the feminist advocacy research scam.
Yep, very much.
So with that, do you have any last statements, Prim?
No, I think we've talked it all out. I think I kind of gave my closing speech a little earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just down to men and women. There's lots of factors, and somehow they always seem to miss it.
Yeah. Well, and what kind of labor are men stuck with that they don't get? that women never admit that they experience on the basis of women's behavior in the workplace?
And they have to get stuck doing all the physical labor as well. So they don't even catch a break.
Yep. And with that, I'd like to thank Prim for sticking it out as my lone co-host tonight. And also everybody for listening and dealing with this ridiculously frustrating topic, and also listening to my crazy stories. And
your crazy stories are the best part.
I hope so. And everybody who's involved in the background makes HBR Talk happen. And good night, all.